Hey, what's up? It's Jake from Nimbus DevOps, and I'm going to get you started with Kubernetes in less than 5 minutes. So, a lot of people explain this like this really long way with all this terminology and stuff. You don't really need to know any of that to get started. You can just learn it along the way. So, first thing you're going to need is something to build a cluster. So, we're going to actually use Chocolatey to install something called Minikube. Once Minikube is installed, then you can go ahead and create a cluster. So, I'm going to check Minikube version, make sure it's installed. And once I've checked that it's installed, I can run something called minikube start, and that will create my cluster. This cluster is basically a single node, which means it's like one, in this case, container. It could be a VM, an instance, whatever, a Raspberry Pi. And on that node is going to be a bunch of stuff like services, containers, things like that. One of them is an API server. So what that does is it allows us to communicate with Kubernetes with a client, and that client is kubectl. So what's happening right now is Docker has a Minikube container, and it's pulling that down from Docker Hub, and it's going to go ahead and build that container and create our cluster. So in the meantime, what you can do is you can install the Kubernetes CLI. So I'm going to open up another one of these windows, and you can just say Choco install Kubernetes CLI. Now, I've already installed it, so you go ahead and do that, and I will skip this part. So once you have your Kubernetes CLI installed, then you can start checking on your cluster. The first command you should learn is kubectl config view, and what this does is it shows you the configuration of your cluster. This is not going to work until you have a cluster, so you want to wait for this to finish. And now that mine's done, I run the config view, and my PowerShell decides to die. Let's try it over here. Config view. Couldn't find file kubectl. Oh, I need to reinstall this. Okay, cool. Let me do that real quick. So let's do Choco install Kubernetes CLI. And then it's probably going to mean forced to do a reinstall. Denied. Access path. I did this as an administrator. Okay, let me go yes to all. Denied. Throwing an error. Okay, let's double check this. kubectl version. Sweet. Alright, so now let's do a config view, and I can see the configuration of my cluster. So there, if you have a problem, you just saw me troubleshoot it. Okay, so now that we have cluster information, and feel free to look at this all you want later, we can put something in the cluster. So we're going to build a container. We're going to build an Nginx container. We're going to do this two different ways. We're going to do it in the command line, and we're going to do it with a file. So first, you need to understand that you don't just deploy containers in Kubernetes. You deploy a pod with a container in it. And Kubernetes manages the pods, not the actual containers. Now the pod definition will be like, yes, I have a container and it's called this, and I got the image from this container registry or whatever. And you'll see that here in a second. So let's first get the list of pods that we have right now. So kubectl get pods. I have no pods. So let's now build one. I can say kubectl run Nginx, and I'm going to get my image from the Nginx image in the Docker Hub. Now, if you want to see this, you could say get pods, and you can see you have an Nginx pod and it's ready and running. That's cool. But with Minikube, you can also run Minikube dashboard, and it automatically builds a dashboard for you. Bam. And you can click on your pod and you can go in there and get the logs and do all the things. Very cool. So now let's say we want to build a second pod. Let's say I want to build an Apache pod. I could build an Apache pod the same way. And we come here and we can see it's pending. It's in a status of container creating. And then in only a few short seconds, it will be running. Now, let's say, okay, well, we actually want to remove that pod. So we do kubectl delete pod Apache. and we can see that it has been deleted. I come here and it's already gone. Super simple, super simple. So the next thing you want to do is be able to do it with a file, because maybe you don't want to run all of these commands manually. So what you'll do is kubectl, actually let's just do exactly what we did with HTTPD. But instead of just hitting enter and then running it and it builds it, we're going to do a dry run. And we're actually going to output the contents of that dry run in YAML format to a httpd.yaml file. Oops, I forgot equals client. So now I have this file, and if we open it, this is like a default shell. So instead of remembering or learning what are all the things that need to be in a file, like, yeah, there's 4 things: API, version, kind, metadata, and spec. But you can just build this and then be like, okay, now I can just come in here and start changing things or adding resources and limits and things like that. And you can just Google that in the Kubernetes documentation and customize it all you want. So now that I have this, what do you do with it? Well, if you want to use this, first of all, the file in Kubernetes is called a manifest. So now you know what a pod, a manifest, and a cluster, an API server is, and a client. So you can say kubectl create with a file, -f for file, httpd.yaml. And it creates the pod just like when I did the command line version. The only difference is all of the parameters are inside this manifest. And then you can delete them the same way. If you wanted to delete this pod, I can delete it, and it deletes the pod that I created. You can see here terminating with the file. And that's pretty much it. The other alternative command you can do instead of create is apply. For now, don't dig into why are there 2 commands. Just know that there are 2 ways to do it. You can do create or apply. And there you go. So now you can build a cluster. You have a dashboard. You can look at the logs. You can do all this stuff, and you can build and destroy pods with containers in them from various places with both command line and the manifest file. I hope that helps, and good luck in your Kubernetes journey.